Tonight's the fifth lecture of Snake Pit National Security Clash of Personalities, 52 to 56. So you can see it's the nitty-gritty of what happened in Israel, all of which is part of the early years of the state, but is fundamental to politics anywhere. If you start, for example, with the United States of America, we all know George Washington, a very famous president, first president, and he had a very distinguished cabinet, including the Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton. If you know anything at all about Washington administration, it was a snake pit. It was a cat fight. Hamilton and Jefferson tried to destroy each other using every possible trick in the book, and they both succeeded in damaging each other pretty heavily over the course of the Washington administration, all of which goes to show you that in the best of situations, politics is what it is. It doesn't encourage chesed, right? Lashon tov, right? Brotherhood and all the rest of it. I mean, they say they do because they're politicians, but what it actually encourages is the reverse. And so, hence, don't be surprised if Israel, which is a democracy with all its flaws, which is a democracy, going to have the same kinds of business, except here we're going to see how it affects national security, the future of the state, its position in the world, and things of that nature. Like in every country, especially every democracy, Israel have its savage side of the politics and the genteel side of the politics. The savage side, Ben Gurion versus Menachem Begin, savage side of politics. Each one would like to kill the other one if they had a chance. They call each other the worst names, and they meant it, and so forth and so on. Here's the genteel side of politics. Ben Gurion, the religious parties, they're not a problem. Not in the 50s. It's not. I'm talking about today. I'm talking about that time. The Aguda, 4 seats. The Mizrahi, 10, 12 seats. They totally go wrong with everything he wants to say. They're just interested, as I said before, getting a bigger piece of the pie for yeshivas, for schools, for Ben Akiva institutions, things like that. As far as foreign policy, whether there should be more raids or less raids, whether the army should be built this way or that way, whether there should be pro-American foreign policy, pro-Soviet foreign policy, whatever, leave that up to Ben Gurion. So he's actually has a very polite relationship with these people, which means he has a certain contempt for them, because you don't have to engage with them in fisticuffs. The political culture of the ruling party, there was a ruling party in Israel at that time, in a way that you don't exactly have today, and this is Mapai, Meflega Pol Eretz Yisrael. This is the party Ben Gurion and the others built up, and in their heyday, and this was the heyday, the 50s was the heyday. In their years, they were like the Communist Party. They were the ruling party, and they held on to control of all the important institutions of the state. Okay, so Ben Gurion, obviously, Sharet was number 2 as the foreign minister. With all their disagreements, they still have a whole system which they agree to disagree behind doors, but in public, they present a united front. Lavon at that time was the head of the agriculture ministry. Eshkol was a really big macher running the development of the country. Golda Meir did her thing. These are a few of a dozen or maybe 15 big important bosses, okay, where they had the daya and they had the control of the jobs, and they decide where the foreign policy is, they decide where the money is, and that's how it goes. Everything is decided by a vote, that's true, but it's a consensus that precedes the vote, as is always the case in these sort of things. Kind of reminds you of certain synagogues, and not in Baltimore. And the Mapai has a thing called Sarenu, which means all the Sarim get together in a meeting before they have the cabinet meeting, they decide on the line. They have Chaverenu, which is all the members of the Knesset belonging to the party, the 40 or so, get into a meeting before and they get their marching orders. You see, I mean, it's debated and all the rest of it, but it's what you call, in the socialist world, it's called democratic centralism, which means you get to all say your opinion, and then the final opinion is said either by vote or by the top guy or something like that, or somebody says, I have my way, or I'll scream, or I'll leave, like a show. And once that's in, you're expected to get in line behind it, which frankly, as we stand today in gridlock in Washington, maybe it has its place from time to time. Anyway, the bottom line is that's the way it was in Israel in those days. You did not have anything like Obama versus Congress and any kind of shut down the government. The government in Israel is is a unicameral legislature, which is another way of saying whoever has the majority is the dictator. I mean, literally, because you can vote, you have 61 seats, you control everything, and so it's not possible to have gridlock. They can simply have the wrong policy, maybe, but it'll never be a problem if you can't decide what to do. Ben-Gurion was the guy at the top, as we've seen over and over again. He is, by nature, and this was true of almost his entire career as prime minister, he's mainly preoccupied with military matters. That's who he was. He wasn't a person that was interested in this kind of stuff prior to 1946, till the end of the Holocaust. But after the Holocaust, when it became clear that Israel was going to have to come into a state by a war, he sort of self-taught himself. He read all the books, and he listened to lots of people, and that's what he did for the rest of his life. He was really focused like a laser on military matters, and especially what it takes to build up an army. I'm not talking about actual strategy in battle, that you have to leave to professionals. But what is it, how big should an army be? What kind of profile should it be? I'll give you just a little example. Should you have a bomber force? Should you have a fighter force? What exactly, what kind of training should go in for the officer corps? All this kind of nitty-gritty stuff is what he wallowed in for all these years. And he's also into high politics. In other words, America, Russia, Israel, these kind of issues, the Arabs in big letters. Ben-Gurion was bored with economics. He knew as much about economics as I do. He was bored with most domestic affairs. That's who he was. And that's probably true of many administrations. But therefore, when you worked under him, you had a lot of, what's the right word, autonomy. And you had a lot of areas. He delegated very well. He wasn't interested in poking his nose in how's the education minister running the classrooms and all that stuff, except in big ways. So it's just an interesting situation. That's how the Israeli government ran. Ben-Gurion liked to, but when it comes to national security, he liked to be the dictator. He liked to control all the aspects of the national security. He was the prime minister, but he also was, all of his years, the minister of defense, which means he's political in the cabinet. He's the one in charge of all matters of the army and things like that. He was the charismatic boss of the armed forces, and no one really challenged him in these matters, because after all, he's the guy that created it. That's the way they saw it. He made the tzal, he appointed the officers, he remembered when they brought the ship over with the plane, with the guns, and all this sort of business. And so, theoretically, everything should go by whoever's the political appointee head of the Defense Department. But in Israel, he was, but that's not where his authority came from. It came from the charisma, because it was Ben-Gurion. Now, in addition, it so happens in Israel, the way it worked out was that he controlled the FBI and the CIA. Okay? That's because when it was set up, Israel, let me repeat. Israel is a unicameral legislature, one house. And there's a cabinet. So anything that happens in the government has to be assigned to some cabinet department or ministry. You understand? That's how it goes. Is this under the agricultural ministry? Is this run by the education ministry? Is this under the commerce ministry, under the labor ministry, etc.? So that's fine. Anything that has to do with farmers, I guess you know where to put it. But when you have certain things that don't quite fit very well, then there's a miscellaneous called the prime minister's ministry. Right? There was a separate ministry of the prime minister, in which it's like I say, catch is catching. You throw all the other departments that don't fit anywhere else. So from the very beginning, Ben-Gurion had his own kind of personal ministry, and one of the things that he wanted to have in that was the FBI and the CIA, or as they call in Israel, the Sherut Betikon Klali, the Shabak, the Shin Bet, and what eventually as you call in America, the Mossad. Okay, that means that the people in charge of all this reported directly to him and to nobody else. So that's not exactly the case in the United States of America. To give you one example, the FBI belongs to the Justice Department. Okay? Now, under J. Edgar Hoover, you had issues, and you did. And there are good things and bad things that came as a result of that. The CIA does report to the president, but the CIA also has to report to the Congress. Because after the scandals back in the 70s, some of us remember, the Congress set up the oversight committees because they didn't like a situation in which everything's going to one guy and he controls this huge operation. In Israel, you never had till this day that kind of an issue. It's understood that the prime minister, among other things, is not simply the guy that sits at the head of the cabinet table, although he does, but one of the things he does is he's personally the guy in charge of the FBI and the CIA, which is a very powerful role, because in the United States, until 9/11, it was federal statutes, as we all know, walling off. I know you're all well read, and most of you know what I'm talking about. There are federal laws to prevent the creation of a super spy system in which you have Big Brother. In Israel, they had Big Brother from day one, and they still do. It's a different kind of a system. They don't. In Israel, anybody who's ever been in the airport know they totally racially profile you all the time, and they have no bones about it. And they can do it because there's no law against it. And it's not like the FBI is not going to report what's going by statute to the CIA or vice versa. They want to know everything about everybody, and they want to centrally control it. There's the history, which I won't go into now, of how all this came to be, but suffice it to say that this guy, by 1952, was the boss of both. Right? Israel was a early Zionist and so forth, and he came up with the FBI part, the local snoops. You get it? His job in the 40s was to spy on fellow Jews in Palestine. I'll give you an example, the communists. Just give one example. The Begin guys, the Irgun, and things like that. This was, you bug apartments. There's no, how shall I say, privacy laws, or there's no constitution in Israel to prevent these sorts of things. And especially in the early years, Ben-Gurion didn't want any. And so there's nothing that you do which actually illegal. You follow? The only thing is it's going to be a scandal. For example, in 49 or 50, they caught him putting bugs under the Mapam party, not cabinet meetings, but when the political officials of Mapam get together, and they're listening to private conversations of an opposing political party, which sounds like this is a purely partisan act rather than national security. Of course, they say, oh, no, this has nothing to do with that. This is simply because of communism. I'm just trying to share this with you to show that the Prime Minister of Israel, especially in the Ben-Gurion years, had, in addition to the army, he had a lot of snoop power in there. And Israel was a very good organizer, and he put together the FBI. And since the CIA, or the Mossad as they call it, never got its act together, they tried this guy and they tried that guy. Eventually, Ben-Gurion said, the heck with it, they put him in charge of everything. And he was the controller for 10 years or more of both the Shin Bet, the internal security, and the Mossad, which is the external, which would mean a very powerful person. Okay? And he reported to a grand total of one person's. Okay? So I'm just trying to lay the background for all this. And look, Israel was under attack. National security was very important, obviously, and they felt they didn't have time for fooling around. Now, there were no checks and balances, is what I'm trying to get across, in the national security level, except at the level of the cabinet. Because one of the interesting things about Israel is that they had a tradition, they still do, that almost everything is voted on. Okay? In fact, that's part of the Zionist culture and part of the Central European political culture, which is that the cabinet, whatever the top group is, Shapokas knows in almost every affair. I'll just give you one example. When they appoint a new ambassador to another country, it has to be approved at the cabinet level. You see? When they appoint a deputy chief of something or other, it has to be approved at the cabinet level. It's kind of interesting in that regard, but that way they get what they call ministerial responsibility. I don't want the Mizrahi to complain about it. You voted for it. I don't want this party or something to complain about it. You voted for it. I don't want somebody to say we shouldn't deal with Germany. Ben-Gurion said, I'm putting on the table and I want to vote. You see? And it's supposed to be majority rule, meaning if you're outvoted, you're outvoted. If you start not to listen, then leave the cabinet. And that happened a bunch of times in the 50s and the 60s, in which case he would bring down the whole government. It happened repeatedly, and reconstitute a cabinet with the basis that you've got to go along with everything that the cabinet is saying. So this is not exactly the American system. Of course, we have a presidential one with checks and balances and separation of the powers. In Israel, they never had that, and they still do not today. So whenever, this is what I was talking about last week, whenever there was a question about should they make a raid over the border, it's got to be at the cabinet, right? And many times, not a few times, Sharet, who was very eloquent, and he was also a macher in the party, and he had a lot of friends and followers the way Ben-Gurion did. If anything, Ben-Gurion was a put-offish type of person individually, and very bossy, and a lot of people didn't like to be around him. Sharet was a different type of guy. He was OCD, but he was still the type of person that was more socially, socially integrated. And many times he said like this, we're voting against this raid, and it didn't happen, which was a huge tension between him and Ben-Gurion, as I tried to lay out last time. And I'm not finished with it tonight. It'll go on in the future, because it's a very big part of the story of the history of Israel in the early 50s. As I said, Ben-Gurion really disliked interference in his area of responsibility, but he himself had been set up the system. He's part of the system in which if they vote against it, you can't do it. As you'll see later on. In 54, 55, and 56, 10, 15, 20 times, Dayan, the chief of staff, says, I move that we should have declared war on Egypt and invade right now. And every time it was taken up at the cabinet level, and sometimes Ben-Gurion was for it, sometimes he wasn't, but even when he was for it, Sharet was against it, and they voted it down. You understand? He could get from the other guy, said, what are you starting a war? Are you crazy? That sort of thing. So that's how it went. So the scene is set, if you followed everything I just said, for this climate of a court, like a king's court. Because officers and mid-level officials in the armed forces intrigue to get into the good graces of Ben-Gurion, and they slander rivals. Because he's the guy that holds all the keys to the power, and if you get in tight with Ben-Gurion, then that's all you need. The two leading examples of what I'm talking about, of young people who wormed their way through Ben-Gurion to rise to the top, leap over many other bodies, and shoot their way to the top, strictly through their totally tight relation with Ben-Gurion, is Shimon Peres and Moshe Dayan. Have you heard of them? Right? Shimon Peres became the number 2 at the Defense Ministry, Director General. That's a very powerful position, at the age of 28. How do you think all the others really felt about it at that time? The guy's in there. Right? He kissed up to the guy, the old man. He got it. And Moshe Dayan was, believe it or not a high-level general. And yet they leapfrogged him over to others, and Ben-Gurion put him in charge of the entire army when he was 33, 34, something like that. It's not the way people have to look up the dates. And how did this happen? You see? Was it that they were outstanding? Now, they were outstanding in their talents, as you'll see. But on the other hand, it's most unusual, and they didn't get there through a vetting process. They got there because they were tight with the guy that counted. The KGB knows this, because they're very smart, and they use it to their advantage. And they got a guy, Israel Be'er, right there, who was a professor of military science and all this kind of business. And he was originally Mapam, but then all of a sudden he starts kissing up Ben-Gurion, writing articles, what a brilliant guy he is and all the rest of it. Ben-Gurion falls for it because everybody falls for flattery. Is that true? Right? You know, the dentist tells you don't inhale, right? But we all inhale. And so next thing you know, he's real close to Ben-Gurion. And next thing you know, Ben-Gurion every night invites him over to help him write his daily diary in which he puts down all the secrets. And next thing you know, Russia has all the secrets because this guy was a KGB agent. Okay? And they don't officially find him and catch him and all that for 10 years. Okay? So this shows you how smart Russia is. You and I know this, if you know anything at all. Have you heard of Aldrich Ames and Kim Philby and all this sort of thing? And we don't know 3/4 of the guy. You know, they only catch 1 out of 10. Okay? They're so good at that sort of thing. But in Israel, it didn't take too much brains. Right? All you have to do is get him with Ben-Gurion, say he's a great guy, kiss your way into the defense ministry, move up on the thing, and next thing you know, you're in with all the secrets. So think about this. All the super secret state that Israel maintained in the 1950s, it was a society, and there's some people here who were in Israel at that time, you never talked about defense matters. All matters of bitachon and security were left out of the newspapers. They never said the names of generals or officers. Everything was euphemism and all the rest of it. Later they developed secretly an atomic bomb. Yeah, right. Russia knows about everything because they got a guy right in there. And he had a whole legend. He said he had fought in the Spanish Civil War. And so it was all a lie. Okay? So this is Israel's Kim Philby, so to speak. By the way, this is the signature KGB style. This is what they're good at. You can be darn sure that the Russian intelligence today has somebody, I don't know who, up there next to Obama that, you know, you never know about. I'll start a rumor, Axelrod, you know, listen. Right? Here, run with that ball. Wouldn't it be funny if I was right? Stranger things have happened. As a matter of fact, here's a person back in the 1930s, Walter Kravitsky, who wrote a book about this in 1939 before Stalin bumped him off. You can go to the library, get it. He said, I was in Stalin's Secret Service. And he was a big macher in the predecessor to the KGB in the 20s and the 30s, a Jewish guy. His name was Shmuel Ginsburg, really. He said, what else is new? So, wait a minute. These Jews built Stalin, they built the KGB. I'm sorry to say. And he said he had this method in which you just find the top guy and get somebody right next to him. And he asked permission from the Soviet government in 1923 to put a guy right next to this little nut in Germany called Adolf Hitler. and they said no at the time. Otherwise, he wrote in this book that he published in 1989, we could be right up there, right next to him. You understand? That is how they operate. Okay, so anyway, in addition to the intrigue of people around Ben Gurion angling for his favor, there's an additional tension between the Ben Gurion lieutenants, the young guys that I just mentioned, like Shimon Peres and Moshe Dayan and others like that, and Issa Harel, if you wish, and the Machers in the Mapai party, such as we saw before. There's Golda Meir, and people you never heard of, David Remez and Zalman Aran. These were big people in the party, in the Partai, in the Mapai. And what's this business that these young guys are doing all the secrets around us, and they know everything, and they're not really party members, they're just opportunists, which is of course true, and they moved everything, next thing you know, they'll push us out, and they'll take over, and there was a lot of backbiting and in and out, if you read all these diaries that they all write about each other. In addition, in the years we're looking at, in 51 to 55, Ben Gurion also has to contend with his fellow cabinet party, with the General Zionists, what today they would call the Liberal Party, part of the Likud, who constantly fight with him over economic matters. The General Zionist Party was capitalist. You understand? Bernstein was one of the big leaders, people you've never heard of, and there's a reason you never heard of them, right? But nevertheless, in their day, and in Israeli politics, there was something. In the 51 elections, the General Zionist Party went from 7 to 21. They tripled in one election. So Ben Gurion had to take them in the party, in the cabinet. And so all these years they're fighting, they're saying, it's like Democrats and Republicans, you're stifling private enterprise, you're preventing any normal investor from trying to put money in Israel, you're making it that you can't fire anybody, you're making it that you're doing fixed price price controls, I'm talking about wage controls, and you won't let the guy calculate how much money they pay his workers, and all that sort of thing. And Ben Gurion and his party is saying, no, the workers should predominate over everything, notice we should, and we should control the levers of power. And so there's a lot of backbiting back and forth in all these years. There was so much backbiting over this that in 53, Ben Gurion had almost like a breakdown close to it, and so he said, I need a rest, right? And I'm quitting. And he said he's retiring totally. As we know, it came back after a year, but he said he's retiring totally. And plus, he said, I want to set an example of chalutziyut, of being a pioneer, because he saw in 53 already, the youth of Israel are now going corrupt. They want to live in places like Tel Aviv and Haifa, enjoying the bourgeois flesh pots. You see, what happened? Well, you see, you have to understand. See, there's two things, and we'll be talking about this later in this series, I hope. There's Zionism, and of course religious Zionism, and then there's socialist Zionism. And socialist Zionism is a variation of Zionism. A regular Zionist said like this, we want to have a state, and it's a country of our own, liyotam chavshi be'artzenu, and then Sean, get off my back. It should be, if I want to be a dentist, I'll be a dentist. If I want to be a cab driver, I'll be a cab driver. I want to do whatever I want to do. That's the bourgeois mentality. And then the socialists tell us, no, the establishment of state, which is an end, no, it's servicing a higher end. The socialist integration, the creation of a perfect socialist state for the Jewish people. It won't happen today, but eventually it'll happen. And what does that mean? Everybody should be in a kibbutz of some type or another, more or less. Losers and old people live in the cities. But that's it. But anybody that's capable is and guess what? Boys and girls or teenagers don't necessarily feel like that. So Ben Gurion was very angry about that, and he said, if I go off to a kibbutz in the Negev, where you have to scratch the ground from the beginning, maybe this will set an example for the youth to abandon such decadences as girls with long hair and skirts and going to movies and what did he say? He said it was against ice cream shops and things like this. It's a certain mentality. I'll tell you, in Israel for 20 years, they were in principle, you're going to laugh at what I'm saying, in principle, very strong in principle, opposed to color TV, right? That's the ultimate decadence. You see? Black and white. Where's the color? That's a decadent business. In America, actually, if anything, we go the extreme end or the consumerism, don't we? But this is a crazy thing on the other end. So I'm just trying to tell you that's what happened. I'm not going to show you the movie I showed you last week, where he demonstrably is plowing and moving the hay and all the rest of it. And therefore, he was out of the picture for a while. Well, we'll see. The prime minister's position went to Sharet, Moshe Sharet, and the defense ministry, he went to Pinchas Lavon, the guy who had been the agriculture minister, who had been a big macher in the Mapai party. So here, take a look at this. Here's Ben Gurion going off to the kibbutz, you understand? And he's all happy that everybody's watching him. And this is Sde Boker in the Negev. It's actually a nice place if you've ever been there in the near the crater, the Machtesh Ramon, and what do you call it? There's Sharet becoming the prime minister, and he's taking and there's Pinchas Lavon, who's the new defense minister, guy from Poland, and he's, as I say, going to now take over a very important post. It's funny that he picked a guy like this, who didn't have any background in defense, which leads cynic to think like this. He wanted him to fail, so he can come in. He's saying, you don't want to put the right guy in, because then it might do too good of a job. Again, it sounds like certain shows I know. Anyway, in a Machiavellian fashion, before he retired to the job, he appoints Dayan and Peres to the top positions in the defense. Okay? Neither of whom are loyal to Lavon, but they're loyal to Ben Gurion. So the number two, the guy who's running the defense ministry in day-to-day, what they call in Israel, the Mankal, Menahel Klali, of the Ministry of Defense, which is not only the army, but it's a bunch of factories, and it's a whole big operation in Eretz Yisrael. I'm sure many know that. And the guy who's actually the professional chief of the army are Ben Gurion loyalists, and certainly not Lavon. Whatever Lavon wants to do, they immediately run to Ben Gurion down to State Boker, and they run it by him. So it got to be crazy. Who's in charge? This is not the way to run a business. If you appoint somebody, then give him a head. Right? If I put you in charge of the shop, you're in charge of the shop. If you do a good job, fine. If you do a bad job, get rid of him. But you don't do that. But that's not how it happened. Okay? And so although Lavon is formally the Minister of Defense, and in a well-organized system would have the power to follow through on his own ideas, in reality, his hands were bound by the Dayan and Peres and Ben Gurion in the background, who said, me, I'm just a farmer and all this. But every week they're driving down or flying down over there to talk all the time. So this is a highly dysfunctional organization chart. I hope you'll understand that. And it will have consequences. The army officers, naturally, follow the lead of General Moshe Dayan, and they show contempt for Lavon. After all, what do you know about defense matters? You see? Now, theoretically, in any kind of a government, the top guy is the top guy, and all the people down should show deference, and if he doesn't understand something, explain it to him. And no, that's not how it happens in the 50s over there. Lavon reacts to this by trying to show that he's not a wimp, and so that he'll get respect, and therefore he advocates harsher and harsher reprisal raids, which I told you last week in 54, they get bad. Now, here I found over there the Kibbutz raid, which is a little bit earlier, but it's an example of a type of thing that we were talking about last week, which is associated, ironically, with Pinchas Lavon's time, even though he wasn't necessarily the one who thought all this stuff up, but he went along with it. This was from the international news.
Silently, a villager searches for the body of his boy. The attack prompts the United States, England, and France to deliver their sharpest rebuke to Israel since its founding and to demand stern action to punish the guilty troops. The boy, one of Kibbutz 66 victims, is carried away as the United Nations launches an investigation of the explosive tensions that walk the border.
Now, the worst part of this is as follows. Now, into this new dysfunctional situation, the army starts to do things without asking Rishus. Okay? When Ben Gurion was in charge, so naturally he's the boss, and he tries to ram it through the cabinet, and he often does, but when he doesn't, he doesn't. Now, you don't tell Lavon. I mean, just tell Ben Gurion down there, you see? He's not in power, but it's not about... And Sharet, who's the prime minister, he doesn't have what it takes to fire everybody, and he'll hurt his own political position, besides which he was really Hamlet. That's who Moshe Sharet is. He's the real Hamlet. To be, not to be, yeah, no, yes. And he pulls his hair every time he's presented with a fait accompli, and he pours all of his bile into his nightly diary. You read this stuff, it's in wonderful Hebrew, but oh boy, it's Hamlet, you understand? And it's he's just suffering. Now, Moshe Dayan feels his oats, because he knows that he's only responsible for Ben Gurion, who out of office, Ben Gurion now has what the British used to call power without responsibility. Stanley Baldwin, the famous British Prime Minister, once said, the press, lords, seek power without responsibility, the prerogative of the harlot down the ages. You understand? And there's a lot of truth to it. Because here's Ben-Gurion saying, don't look at me, I'm just giving ideas, I don't have any power anymore, but really does. And so it's a very dangerous situation in any political system when you have someone who has power without responsibility. That's why we set up the governments that we do. So Obama, remember the Truman sign, the buck stops here? It does, right? And there's certain other places, the buck stops, there are people that are responsible for all that. If you just shoot your mouth off and have consequence of what you say, then it's really a problem. Think about those who got us into the Iraq War, to the Vietnam War, to the other war. I'm talking about the journalists and others. They can say whatever they want, and then they go away. They sleep at night. It's a scary kind of a situation. To make matters worse, Moshe Dayan consistently advocated attacking Egypt during 1954 and 56. Those 3 years, soldiers, naturally Israeli soldiers, dreamed of conquering the Gaza Strip, expelling its inhabitants, improving Israel's borders, and giving Egypt, with its toxic daily broadcasts against Israel, a black eye. This was crazy, but tempting. Meaning the army officers also don't have responsibility for Israel's situation in the international arena. They say, we know this will work militarily, and whatever happens after that, that's your job, the politicians, to take care. It's not realistic. Israel would learn this lesson, by the way, 2 years later in the Sinai campaign. Whereas, they took over the Sinai, and then when they get out of it, nothing, they had to withdraw. You see? Power is a dangerous business. And military power is an extremely dangerous business that has to be wielded very, very carefully. And it's not like some movie, guys, I'm going to show them or whatever. This is real life. And we in America have made our share of mistakes. I mean, big-time mistakes, when we have ignored these basic limitations on power. And so anyway, that's what's happening all during these years. The cabinet, all during 54, 55, and 56, repeatedly rejects this suggestion. So over and over again, Dayan is saying, and these generals, you can just take a look at them. They're a bunch of live lions, which is good to be in office, but they're ready to go any minute. Okay? This guy Mott, and there was another guy, Bear Hartzion. Oh my goodness, and Ariel Sharon, you can just imagine. All right? And that's Sharon. And they're ready to go at any time. And they say, well, let's take out Nasser and blow up Egypt and conquer and give them black eye. And what'll happen? Oh, we'll show the Arabs. And Sharek keeps saying, and then what? Right? He's asking the question that people need to ask. And then what happens after that? Oh, we'll show the Egyptians. And then what? I don't know, but we'll show they'll change the government. And how's that going to happen? He said, oh, we'll conquer Egypt. Oh, really? You're going to take over Egypt? The Tzahal should go into Cairo? Is this the plan? Right? They're supposed to go into Alexandria? And then what happens? And what if they shoot at you? What happened? No, don't ask me to go. These are the kind of cabinet things that went on, as they say, all during the time. The public was completely unaware of any of this, obviously. Look, it's a highly dangerous situation I'm describing. The military is supposed to define itself by utter subservience to the democratically constituted civilian authorities. That is what we hope a democracy is. 7 days in May and all that stuff, right? You don't want that. The Israeli army had not really absorbed this idea in the 50s. Instead, it displayed a kind of personal loyalty to Ben-Gurion, who, as I told you before, enjoyed a unique charismatic authority. They were loyal to him as the boss, or Hazakain, the old man, not as the civilian leader per se. And this was a problem, because if that's so, let him be in office and live with the consequences. A democracy must above all stress process and institutions, not charismatic personal authority. True? A democracy is all about the institution. It's not about the guy, because you'll never always have the president you want. And you'll never always have the Secretary of State of Defense that you want. And you'll never have the Chief of Staff and all that you want. But what's supposed to happen? Everything should fall apart? It's the system. Right? We pride ourselves in America being a country of institutions, of laws, as we call them. And that's what keeps the Republic going for a couple hundred years. Well, we know it now. But we've had our mistakes in American history, and Israel was very early in these years. They're brand new to it, and it wasn't so simple. And so a process should, as I said before, democracy should stress process institutions, not charismatic personal authority. But Ben-Gurion had always been quite comfortable with wielding unique power over the entire national security structure with no checks and balances. Remember, he had the power, and they still do, to arrest and hold without trial. Okay? We're back to Abraham Lincoln times. The law in Israel till this day is they have not ever gotten rid of what they call the British regulations, which were in the books in the British Mandate, and they simply never withdrew them because they're what shall I say, comfortable for the government. And they have the right that they can do like in a movie, just arrest you and hold you in jail or hold you wherever, and not tell anybody about it, and not get you a lawyer, and you don't have a right to habeas corpus, and so forth and so on. Right? If they wish to, and once in a while they do it. You know and I know, not long ago, I don't even know the whole story, but we all saw a little while ago that Australian guy, whatever, has committed suicide. Remember, it wasn't too long ago in the spy system, and the government never still told what exactly happened, and I can't tell it, and I don't think you can either. But he was in under this business, where they just yanked him, and who knows what it was all about, and that's my point. They have this power of who knows. So Israel does maintain, which you cannot do in the United States, although I have to modify that also, don't I? Because there's a thing called Guantanamo. But that's highly unusual. In Israel also it's highly unusual, but when you know that if you step over certain lines, Ben Gurion can yank you out of bed if he wants to, that kind of has a bracing effect upon the nature of public discussion of national security issues. And everybody in Israel knew this. And I'll repeat, this law is still in the books today. The only thing is, the public goes along with it because it's used very sparingly and mostly on Arab terrorists, right? It's very rarely used on Jews, but if they thought, this is what I'm about to tell you has happened. If they thought that somebody from the West Bank, from the Gush Etzion wants to blow up the Kotel or whatever like that, it's happened before that they just pulled a guy and held him under arrest for such and such a period. And for all I know, they might still have people like that. And you're not allowed to, and they put a blinker out on the press. You're not allowed to talk about it. And it's harder to do today with the YouTube, but nevertheless they try. And that guy is history, so to speak, or girl, until they decide otherwise. So Israel, I repeat, Israel is not the United States. But to be perfectly honest, I'm a liar, because Abraham Lincoln did it, and Franklin Roosevelt did it, and other presidents have done it, and to a certain degree Obama has done it, and Bush, right? Under unusual circumstances. There are people, listen, President Obama is a liberal, and he is. And nevertheless, and I'm all in favor of this, but nevertheless, he has blown up American citizens overseas without a arrest warrant and without all the other constitutional safeguards. When they dropped this bomb or missile on that American guy in Yemen who was big with the Al-Qaeda, they didn't have a tape recorder a minute earlier saying, you have the right to your... Yeah, right, all like the old TV shows, They just went kablooey. So, hello, Dover who? You understand? And by the way, no one in the United States, no one significant, is protesting what I just said. Because as long as you have a political consensus among the population that this is necessary, as Roosevelt had during the Second World War, as Abraham Lincoln had during the Civil War, as Obama has today in the war against terrorism as they see it, the average American says, Constitution, schmonstitution, I don't want this guy blowing a building like Boston, with the marathon or something like that. That's all we need. So these issues are quite fluid if you want to think about it. So this administratively, structurally unsound situation, where Lavon and here comes the soap opera. Lavon and Sharet hate Dayan, but they can't fire him because they're afraid of Ben Gurion, where the military does not feel bound to listen to civilian authorities they do not happen to respect, was a situation ripe for disaster, and it happened. In order to understand the situation I'm about to talk about, let's take a look for a moment at Israel's intelligence community, as they call it. Basically, it's three components. As I said before, it's the Shin Bet, the Mossad, this the FBI, and the CIA. These are civilian, number one and number two are civilian agencies, and therefore they're directly under the control of the Prime Minister. Number three is a military thing, right? Every army in the world has military intelligence. So does the United States. Meaning you have the CIA, and totally separate from that, you have the Army intelligence, the Navy intelligence, the Air Force intelligence. I think we might have people in the audience here as a part of that stuff. And plus they have the National Security Agency, meaning it's not all one big business. So here's my point. These two report directly to the Prime Minister, in this case, Sharet. Now, is this a Harel, who was a law-abiding type guy, meaning he was a Ben Gurion follower, but he did say, to give him credit, he did say that now it's Moshe Sharet, the Prime Minister, so I report to him. Okay? He did do that. But the third one is not reporting to anybody directly, it's reporting to the head of the army, or in other words, it's reporting to Moshe Dayan. Okay? So he's got, if you wish, he's got his own little CIA operation over there, and that's how the military is set up. This is a basic problem in the intelligence field around the world. How do you coordinate the civilian side of the intelligence community with the military side of the intelligence community, and every country works it out or fails to, however they do. Okay? Now, here's what happened over here in Israel in the period we're talking about. I want to tell you a little background for a moment. As I mentioned last week, the Israeli army, the Tzahal, during the years I'm talking about, was definitely larger and certainly stronger than the Egyptian army. Even though you look at Egypt so big, you look at Israel so little, which is true, nevertheless, for the reasons I mentioned last week, the Israeli army in the 50s, early 50s, was clearly stronger and more powerful than the Egyptian army. In addition, so in other words, you could sleep in Tel Aviv because Egypt's really not going to attack. If they attack, they would lose. In addition, as an extra safety measure, the Israelis could look to the fact that Egypt in the early 50s was still occupied by the British army, which was a restraint on a potential Egyptian attack on Israel, if you can follow that. The British military presence was in the Canal Zone and was viewed by Israel as a highly desirable phenomenon. So notice here you have Egypt next to Israel, but Egypt wasn't totally free at that time, so to speak. Egypt, as I'll explain in a second, had a large British force in there, and the Egyptians can't attack Israel if you have a big British army unless the British give an okay, and why would the British do that? So, as far as Israel is concerned, having a certain muzzle, if you wish, in Egypt, which was a highly valuable muzzle. But it couldn't last. There is a history of Egypt-UK relations, Egypt-British relations. If you go back, once upon a time, Egypt used to belong to the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and then in the early 1800s, one of the Turkish governors, Mehmed Ali, went in independent for himself. And when he did that, so Egypt became sort of like an independent country for 50, 60, 70 years. And then what happened was that he was viewed by, and Mehmed Ali and his successors, down to Farouk, they're actually from Albania. They're not from Egypt. And so the Egyptian and the people they gave the big jobs to were non-Egyptians. So the local Egyptians didn't like this, and here you have one of those tensions, which thank God characterized all the Arab societies. And so the result was you had all this problem in Egypt. In 1880, this guy Arabi Pasha, who was a officer in the Egyptian army, he was like a Nasser. So he said like this: let's throw out all the foreign influences and Egypt for the Egyptians. And so he made a revolution against the ruler, this guy, Mehmed Tufik Pasha, who was the great-grandson of Mehmed Ali, and he was the king, let's say, the Khedive, as they call him, in Egypt. And so do you follow what I'm saying? This guy wanted to overthrow this guy and set up like an Egypt for the Egyptians type country. He got scared, and he called in the British for help. The British sent in General Wolseley, who defeated the rebellion and restored him to power and kept him on the throne and stayed. They never left. This is what happens. And because the British said like this: Egypt is unstable. The Suez Canal we just bought. The French built the Suez Canal, but they ran out of money. Disraeli chopped it at a bargain price in 1875. Benjamin Disraeli, the Prime Minister of England, grabbed it in a famous coup in 1875. It's one of his famous things in Egypt. When without going into the story, so England owned the Suez Canal. Egypt is too valuable to be left to the Egyptians, and so from then on, the British informally were in charge of Egypt. So they said like this: the king is the king, the Khedive is the Khedive, and there's an Egyptian government, all the rest of it. We're just here to advise. You see? So any kind you had in every Egyptian government ministry, it was a British advisor. And he's got the May and the Dea. He's got the final rule, and the Egyptian couldn't stand this. So until this is the history of Egypt and England. And until the First World War, there wasn't anything they could do about it. After the First World War, there was huge riots all throughout Egypt. They shot the British guy in charge, and oh my goodness, back and forth. And by the time it was all over, they cut a deal. It took them many years. They cut a deal in which they said that the British will withdraw mostly from Egypt. They'll just stay in a few places, mainly around the Suez Canal and things like that. But they have a defense treaty, so that if Egypt ever needs it, the British army will come and rescue them. Which is another way of saying, if the British ever want, they'll take over Egypt if it's necessary. Now, this was necessary. England would not have won World War I and World War II. I say again, World War II, if they didn't control the Suez Canal in Egypt. That's a fact. Hitler would have won. So there's different ways of looking at this. Oh, no question about it. They needed to maintain the access to India and to the Far East and the oil. Oh, goodness. This would have been bad news. It was a vital necessity for British Empire. In the Second World War, the king of Egypt, King Farouk, wanted to side with Hitler and throw the British out and he'll take over. The Germans will take over. He never thought that far ahead. And so Egypt was going to join up secretly with Hitler when Rommel was getting close in 1942. Sadat was famous or infamous for being one of the officers who organized the whole thing and was going to get together and meet with the Germans. The British weren't stupid, and so in the middle of the night, the British ambassador, if you want to call him that, came with a bunch of the soldiers. They seized the palace. They put a gun to the king's head. They did. And they said, either you sign this agreement and appoint a government that we want, which will invite the British army in to rescue the country, or we'll shoot you. And he gave in. He didn't want to. But Churchill said, I guess I ain't got no time for this foolishness. Right? There's a war going on. Rommel's here. And so it worked. The British held Egypt to the rest of the war, and they won, and so forth. And by the way, the world didn't mind. Roosevelt and Chiang Kai-shek met with Churchill at the Cairo conference a year later. This was all, the public opinion was on England's side. But after the war was over, there's a new day, so England realized they have to make nicey, and they have to get better in with the new Egypt and the Arab masses and all the rest of it. So all this is happening alongside the time when Israel's becoming a state. Isn't the Middle East a wonderful place? Now, here's the thing. So this image of trying to get rid of England was the main objective of Egyptian politics. And I can tell you that the defeat of the Egyptian army by Israel in 48-49, because remember, Egypt, although the Egyptians did fight very well, by the time you get to December of 48 and beginning of 49, Yigal alone and the Israeli army, they were about to wipe out the Egyptian army. They did an end run around them. Truman saved them. Otherwise, the army would have collapsed. Some effect of this in Egypt was to totally discredit the regime, which then therefore felt they got to get the British out. And so from then on, 49, 51, 52, and all that, riots against the British, burning down British installations, all that sort of thing. And then in 52, there was a revolution, and Nasser came into power, not right away, but he was one of the big machers. He viewed himself as the successor of this guy, which he was. He said, this guy tried to do it in 1881, and now we're going to do it. And he did do it. And so what he did was, he started negotiating with the British and putting pressure on them, and there's all kind of stories to this, but to make a long story short, he got together with Anthony Eden, the foreign secretary, and they made a deal that the British soldiers are going to get out of Egypt, although England will still own the Suez Canal. Okay, that's if you're just interested in the history of relations between Great Britain on the one hand and Egypt on the other. But how does, and that's how it looks, giving a dry historical lecture somewhere. But how does it look if you live in Tel Aviv? How does it look if you're Ben Gurion or Sharet or Moshe Dayan or one of these guys? They say, "Oy Gewalt, the British army is pulling out of Egypt. Now there'll be nothing left to restrain them from attacking us." Now, in hindsight, and even at that time, a cold military calculus said like this: even to get the British army out, the Egyptian army is still very weak, and Egypt is a pretty weak country, even though they're a big population, and it's take a long time for something like that. That's not how they saw it. And so they panicked, they freaked out. At least many officials in the government did do so, and Moshe Dayan got very worried, and he started saying, can this be stopped? What also scared them was that Nasser was very tight with the CIA. Here's Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's son, who was the CIA chief in the Middle East, and he said at the very beginning, Nasser is not communist, which was true, and he can be our boy, and we should cooperate with him, and let's get very tight relations between Nasser and There's a famous book, Wilbur Evelyn, the CIA spy, who wrote it, Ropes of Sand, in which he gives all, the CIA taught him how to set up a secret police, and showed how to get poisons, and they showed him how to organize his apparatus. Well, let me ask you a question. Didn't we do something like that with Saddam Hussein at one point? You know that. So that's the business of dictatorships in the world, which America is not totally unfamiliar with, unfortunately. And that really panicked the Israelis because, oh, Gewalt, you're going to have Nasser, and it's going to make Egypt it's not powerful, and America is going to get behind him. And, this was the nightmares in the security establishment in Israel, which I can totally understand. And, that's all we need, a U.S.-Egypt relationship. So what are you going to do? So I'll tell you what really happened. And that is that Moshe Dayan concocted a scheme with the head of Amman, with the head of his military intelligence, Colonel Ghibli. All right, this is what really happened with Colonel Ghibli. And the idea was, without asking the political leadership at the top, because I told you the culture was already one in which the army just does what it wants to do. And he said, can we figure out some scheme or some plot to make England and Egypt fight each other, or England and America fight each other? How can we do that in order to stop the British withdrawal from forces from Egypt? Amman had already set up a secret unit, I think it was number 130 or something like that, in the Arab countries under this guy, Avraham Dar. He was an Israeli spy, in other words, and he was in charge of setting up spy rings throughout the Middle East. Look, Israel has spies, the Arabs, that's the way it goes. In April of 52, at the time of the Egyptian Revolution, when Nasser and these guys came to power, he sent a agent named Max Binet to Egypt. He's supposed to be the Israeli James Bond, and he was. Meaning, in Egypt, he comes in, it is a good movie, except it has a bad end. He came in like an ex-German officer, and he was fighting under the Nazis, and he had spent time in Germany. He was originally born in Germany. Here, I'll tell you a piece of totally useless trivia. His grandfather is the guy that wrote the book that they always quote in the Art School Gemara about geography in Palestine in the 1800s, Obermeyer, because he went to Baghdad and the Middle East in the middle 1800s to be the tutor of a Persian prince, and he got the prince to take him on a hunting trip up and down the Nile and Euphrates because he was really secretly looking for Surah and Pumbedisa, which is where the Gemara was put together. Could I make that up? I could, but you know. Anyway, so this guy is a James Bond because he comes in there and he makes the right connections. He meets the right men and the right women in Egypt. Next thing you know, he's with Volkswagen and he's with this group and with this group and he's living the high life, you know, and all part of a plan. And he was a German Jew who made an Aliyah early on. His wife was a South African Jewish girl, you know, Davidov, and you know, and all this kind of stuff. And he put on a show. In addition, the military intelligence, the Amman, the Israeli intelligence, did something which they shouldn't have done, and Israel should never do, but they did it anyway, and that is they recruited Egyptian Jews as spy rings, some of which is something that the Mossad strongly disapproved. When Isser Harel was in charge of the Mossad, they always said like this, don't make a Jonathan Pollard. That's not fair. You understand? You don't get local Jews to act as spies for Israel, because then they can kill everybody. They say, look, you know, they're all spies for Israel. You understand? But the Amman had its own rules. They didn't care in those days. This is in the early years when Israel had to learn everything the hard way, unfortunately. And so they get these young boys and girls, or you know, 18, 20, you know, young people, mostly from Bnei Akiva. Okay? People don't understand. Egypt, I mentioned this earlier today, Egypt prior to the establishment of Israel, up to 1948, 75,000 Jews, half of whom were well-to-do. The Egyptian Jews had it good in Egypt. They owned all the department stores. They owned many of the fancy restaurants, the dress stores, you know, banks, and things like this. Egypt still had, this is what Nasser wanted to get rid of. I don't blame him. Egypt still had a situation under the kings in which a lot of foreigners enjoyed special privileges in Egypt and played very important roles in building up the Egyptian economy. Italians, French, British, Jews, Greeks, people like that did very well in the old days, and they lived a high life. And the Jewish community was quite well-to-do. Now, they had their poor ones also, but many of them were well-to-do, and synagogues, and believe it or not, in the old Egyptian regime, didn't bother them. They had Zionist clubs. In the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, all kind of types, including Bnei Akiva, and parade. I mean, it's incredible. You know, parades with Israeli flags and Yom Ha'atzmaut days. There's a speech I saw. I was talking about Rabbi Yosef a couple of weeks ago. He has a book has a collection of his speeches, and one or two of them, believe this or not, are Yom Ha'atzmaut speeches that he gives in 1949 in Cairo. Okay, imagine a thing like that, and people don't understand. It was a very liberal regime, which of course changed later on. So the Egyptian tradition in this particular regard under the kings was a very liberal one as far as the Jews are concerned. The point therefore is that you have a lot of young boys and girls who are in the RCA, you know, with things like that, who are active in Jewish causes and very heavily indoctrinated with Zionism, and this is very not right what I'm talking about. And the Avram Dar and these other military intelligence guys said, so we want you to come spy for Israel. okay, and set up spy rings. There's Avad Yosef, by the way, dressed fashionably with a fez. This is his yeshiva. Okay, once upon a time, smaller. This is yeshiva Bachrim. It's not exactly near Israel, but it doesn't look so different if you're talking about 1949, if you just change the hats. Anyway, so this is what they end up doing. The most famous of these type of guys, Eli Cohen, who will go on to greater fame later on, as you know, when he is a spy 10 years later in Syria. But originally he's in Egypt. He's actually from Aleppo, Chalabi family. They are Syrian Jews. And they moved to Egypt. His parents, whatever, moved to Egypt. And he grew up over there. Very traditional Sephardi family. I think there was some. I mean, there must have been if it was a Ben Kiva. And that whole sort of thing. And now he's spying for Israel. No, they give him secret training. Some of these people flew secretly to Israel. I mean, the whole thing is quite remarkable. And so far, so good. The spy rings were not active. They said, just get ready until we give you the word. Now, in mid-1954, Gibli and Dayan concoct the following plan. Get the Jewish spies to conduct a kind of mini-terror campaign, putting bombs in public places in Cairo and Alexandria. They should leave behind notes and hints that the bombs were placed by Egyptian fanatics, by the Muslim Brotherhood, etc. The hope was that the Americans, and especially the British, will view the Egyptian situation as unstable. There's bombs going off everywhere, and that the British will change their mind and keep their military forces in Egypt. It's a very Talmudic type of way of thinking, okay? You do this, it'll lead to that, and all the rest of it. And they didn't run this by anybody. Later on, they'll say they did, but they didn't run by anybody. They thought they're such gaonim that they'll come up with a plan like this. It's this very controversial operation, fraught with all kinds of dangers and consequences, was never run by Sharet, who was the prime minister, or anyone else, not even by Lavon. There was zero vetting process. They didn't really run it through a whole big business. As much as they figure this is a good idea, and if it leads to war with Egypt, what the heck, right? And in other words, so this guy and this guy put it together. These guys who are the officials in charge know nothing about it, okay? And my goodness, to make matters worse, the man chosen to direct the operation in Egypt, the man who was supposed to be Israel's top spy and run this particular operation, was a notorious liar and an unstable person. They put the wrong guy in. Is this guy, Avri Elad Seidenberg, who's a German Jew who made Aliyah and had a long history and lying about his thing. And I want to tell you something. This is the early years of Israel. I'll say it again. In the early years, you learn, you make mistakes. At that time, there was a romantic, they must have seen it in the movies, there was a romantic notion that, how do they say it? Poachers make the best game wardens. You take a guy with a criminal background, it's like they saw too many Humphrey Bogart pictures. He said, take a guy with a criminal background, give him a sense of national responsibility, they'll go the extra mile to justify their rehabilitation and everybody. That's not true. You get a person who's unstable, guess what? You end up with a situation unstable. And this is the guy you put in charge of his whole business, this because he didn't run it through any kind of process. You see? They know everything. Here you go. So, instead of being professional, like the other guy, remember, Max Binet, he really was doing the professional thing. This guy, Elad, flaunts a swinging lifestyle in Cairo. He runs around with a Cadillac, and he does all the, calls attention to himself. And this is the guy who knows all about the Israeli spies in Egypt. He knows them all, which is a basic violation of spy business, right? When they call in Israel midur, or compartmentalization. And so, what happened? The spy rings are activated in the spring and summer of 54. There's fires set off and bombs in the post office in Alexandria, sometimes in post boxes, in mailboxes. There's a bomb put in the American Library in Cairo. And finally, they want to do so, put them in the biggest movie theaters in the same day in Cairo and Alexandria. That's all we need. But on the way, carrying it there, and these guys weren't, who are we talking about? These are kids who used to be Habunim, Ben Akiva, they're not really super experts in this sort of thing. And so it would be funny if it wasn't unfunny. The bomb blew up on the way there. It exploded in the guy's pants or something, I remember. And the police caught him, and there's no compartmentalization, so everybody knew about everybody else. And so the Egyptian authorities simply rolled up the whole spy ring. They found this guy who knew about this one. Then they went to this one and knew about this one. And knew about this one. And they got them all the ones in all over the place. They even got Max Binet, who was not part of this whole thing. he was their real spy, but somebody along the way knew him, and that took him down. He eventually got killed. It was a complete disaster, okay, on many levels. On the one hand, you lose all your spies. On the other hand, what does Israel look like? Right? I mean, what can Egypt and the others say? Says, we told you about the Zionist plotters all around. This is the real thing, okay? I mean, what explanation can you give to something like this? You can't. And it's a terrible situation. No, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it wasn't they went to one and he led to the other and led to the other. Maybe they were betrayed by Avri Elad, by the guy they sent, the unstable fellow. That's what really happened. Okay? The Egyptians, we don't know how. Maybe for a guy like that might have just sold it out for money. We'll never know. Everybody got arrested and rolled up. He was able to leave Egypt days and days later with no trouble and go to Germany. It was nicht gefährlich. So Israel was faced with a PR disaster, a security disaster, an espionage disaster, etc. The Egyptians tried them and hanged them, or many of them, not all. Some ended up in jail. There was this girl, Marcel Nino. I didn't have time to get off on the YouTube. I just saw before I came here. She's got, if you're interested, look up the Lavon Affair 1954. Maybe you'll find it. She'll tell you that 11 years or something she spent in Egyptian jails and things like this. Till after the 67 war, Israel was able to get him out, exchanged for 10,000 Egyptian prisoners. You see? And it was just a terrible business all along the way because these people were trusting and they thought Israel and the Mossad and the idealism and all the rest of it, and it ended up in the worst possible type of situation. Publicly, Moshe Sharet denies the whole thing. He sent secret word to Nasser, which was the truth. He said, this was done without my knowledge. And he begged Nasser, to give him a break and so forth, but they didn't. They hanged him. I don't blame them either. This guy, Bennett, killed himself the night before. It was what it was. Privately, of course, Sharet, is freaking out now. Who authorized this? Lavon said, not I. Right? Gibli said, yes, you did. Well, who's going? He's going to not take responsibility. Yes, you did. Dayan and Perez back Colonel Gibli. They forged letters to make it look like Lavon ordered the whole thing. Sharet, knowing what's going on, maybe is afraid to tangle head-on with Ben-Gurion's boys. So he sets up a committee. That's what you always do. Whenever in doubt, my constant advice is form a committee and stave off the crisis. So he forms a committee called the Dori Olshan Committee. He was on the Supreme Court. He had been the former chief of the general staff and all the stuff. And Lavon acts like Captain Queeg. He's all nervous during the inquiry and all that. They kind of could smell that he was being framed, but nobody wanted to buck Ben-Gurion and buck Dayan and all that. So the committee is non-committal. Right? They say after it's all over, we can't decide. Lavon resigns in anger. Okay, no problem. Ben-Gurion is recalled to replace him as Minister of Defense. So he's leaving. You can see his face. He's coming back in, and he says, this is great. Right? And welcome to the snake pit, as I told you. Okay? Dayan and Perez are jubilant. They're now in total control of the military, now and they will be for a long time. From then on until the time Ben-Gurion left, they were the bosses. They did run the whole defense business under Ben-Gurion. That is how it went. Lavon is, after all, a big macher in the Mapai party, so they give him a consolation prize and make him head of the Histadrut, which is a very powerful position in Israel because it's the socialist economy, and the Histadrut owns everything and runs everything. Let him get over it and shut up. That's the basic idea. But as we know in America and in other countries, sheker ain't lo raglayim. That a lie doesn't, sooner or later it gets out. You see, it doesn't work. Especially among Jews, we all have big mouths. You understand? Maybe in Russia, China, it goes forever. Here it gets out. And so as the years pass, it becomes increasingly clear that Avri Elad was a double agent. He was caught in 1957 having secret conversations with an Egyptian military attaché in Europe somewhere. What's that all about? You see? Now, Israel, early on, starts to really suspect him. But as I say before, he was a constitutionalist, believe it or not. And he said, I want to get a conviction, and I don't have the evidence yet. You see? But he knows too much. He knows Gibli and Dayan ordered the operation and not Lavon. So what do? You arrest him without trial. And so he was picked up and put away, and eventually gets a secret trial like Vanunu. it's a trial but away from the public, gets a 12-year jail sentence, eventually 10 years, and they figured they'll shut him up. You were not allowed to talk about his name in Israel for 10 years. He was always the third man. They like that movie, okay? No, the Ghibli. Excuse me, I said it wrong. Avri Alad. See, I'm getting mixed up. The guy we had before. He was the third man, as you'll see in a second. In 1960, 4 years later, 6 years later, the girl, the secretary, who typed the original documents, Dahlia Carmel, blabs, and part of the documents were tampered with and forged. In other words, it's Watergate. I told you, Jews can't keep their mouth shut. I found yesterday, some of you, this will take about a minute, and it's in Ivrit. I can't help if you don't understand the Hebrew, but you'll bear with it for a minute. There's what she was like then, and now you'll see her now. And she says in Hebrew, he says, yeah, he told me to change the typewriter and move this line over here and to make another paper look like the first paper and all this kind of stuff. She's just blabbing because now it doesn't matter. And this is the surreal aspect of doing modern Israeli history. Now everything's on Israeli TV shows 50 years later, it's like Watergate. And there you have it. Take a look at this. That's her.
מתבקשת דליה כרמל על ידי מודקה בן צור לשנות משפט והעתק המכתב של גיבלי לדיין השמור בכספת.
אז הייתה הרגשה פתוחה שהמכתב הזה האורגינל לא קיים, שאפשר לשנות את העתק שקיים.
ידעתי שהייתה קבוצה קטנה שסייעה לבנימין לשמור עליו ולהגן עליו בעניין הזה, ולא תמיד בדרך הכשרה.
Lo tamid b'derech hakshera, not always in the right way.
מודקה הביא לי חתיכת נייר שבה היה כתוב מה לשנות, מה להכניס. עבדתי על אותה מכונת כתיבה שתמיד עבדתי עליה, והדפסתי מחדש בדף שני קטע שלם שהתחיל לפי הוראתו של לבון, שלא היה שם קודם. המשפט לפי הוראתו של לבון הוכנס לקטע, לפי הוראתו של לבון הופעלה הרשת.
That's enough. You don't have to see the whole. You get.
שעבדנו אצל המשרד, והייתה הפסקה.
In other words, she just said right in the words, this was ordered by Lavon and all. It's like Nixon's secretary, that sort of thing. So now this was 1960. Ben Gurion was still in power. Shimon Peres was still in power, and Moshe Dayan had just left office, but he was a government minister. So now what? Okay, Lavon immediately says, "I told you so." But if he's right, then Dayan and Peres are guilty, and Sahal is exposed as being corrupt at the top. Ben Gurion, who's the prime minister in 1960, says, Chas v'sholom. He says, this was his language. Tzahal is Kodesh Kodashim. That's what he says. And therefore, shut up, Lavon. Lavon says, I'm not shutting up. I insist on a reopening of the case. And everybody, and all these Israeli newspapers, they start bringing up, I'm Dreyfus. Right? The French officer, what's the right word? Framed by the system. Okay? Where's my Zola? Okay? Why are you allowing this to happen in the state of Israel? The Jewish people should be the last one to do a Dreyfus. And his guys all say, truth like Zola. Truth is on the march and nothing can stop it. Of course, Ben Gurion said it's all lies. Shut up. Dayan and Peres, of course, continue to lie. Dayan, by this time, is an Israeli god. Because after the Sinai campaign. Here, take a look at this. And this is a small piece about the Sinai campaign. And this is how Israelis see Moshe Dayan. For understandable reasons. There's the victorious army in the Sinai desert, and he's the man, right? We all are young enough here to remember the glory days of Moshe Dayan, and you don't want to say this guy did a Watergate, okay? So it is what it is. So the whole Israeli system came under a certain crisis. The Minister of Justice in Ben Gurion's government in 1960 and 6 other cabinet members make a committee to review the whole affair. They diplomatically say as follows. Lavon didn't do it. He should be cleared. We don't know who did it, so let's move on. You understand? Well, that's Levi Eshkol was the one who was pushing that, and Eshkol was number 2 under Ben Gurion. He said, just, bury it. Lavon was framed, let's do that. We don't actually have to know who did it, and weiter. Ben Gurion freaked out. He lost his temper, and he lost his sense of judgment. He said, these are all lies. You're not a judicial committee. I demand that Lavon be fired and kicked out of the Mapai party. And he is, because Ben Gurion is still powerful, but it's done grudgingly. People are saying, he's pursuing a grudge, probably Lavon's telling the truth, whatever. What I'm talking about will contribute significantly to the decline of Ben Gurion's charisma. Okay? It doesn't go away. Ben Gurion won't let go either, although begged to by Mapai. They tell him all during 1961, 62, and 63, let it go. Okay? Say Lavon was framed or something like that. We won't ask who really did it. Moshe Dayan is too popular now anyway. Nobody cares what he did years ago. You're in charge of everything. Give it a rest. And it's hurting the party. Because until now, we've had it great. As long as we hold together, which is true, we dominate Israel. All during the elections of those years, it was always the Mapai had by far the largest number. They always got prime minister, defense minister, foreign minister, finance minister, all these kind of very important key elements in the government. They control the economy. The Histadrut was riding strong. Just let it go. He can't let it go. Okay, he can't. Eventually, Mapai will split over this in the 60s. By that time, many in the party are resentful of Peres and Dayan anyway, and internal Mapai politics becomes totally toxic. I can tell you, and the funny thing is this all happened at the moment, right after the elections of 59, when Mapai had its greatest electoral victory. They got like 47, I think. That was out of 120. That was their biggest showing right after the Sinai campaign. They ran on the slogan, Hagidu Ken Lazaken, say yes to the old man, say yes to Ben Gurion. And they got they didn't get a majority, but they got a very big ruling just from the Mapaitis, besides the other socialist parties. And so everything was going great. This is very much like a Greek tragedy you see all the time. When the group gets very, very powerful, they split over internal matters. We're not totally unused to this in the Jewish community, but I'll go no farther than that. Now, the result is that this is what tore the Mapai apart. After the reopening of the affair, Mapai deteriorates. Ben Gurion certainly does. Within 3 years, he's out. So this took him down. He becomes a grumpy old man who attacks the Mapai party all the time as the epitome of corruption. Hello, he sets up his own party and ruins the career of Shimon Peres. I'll tell you why. Peres was number 2 in defense ministry. He was the golden boy, and he was Ben Gurion's fellow, and he was brilliant. In those years especially, he was very brilliant. We'll talk about that later on. He's a very remarkable person. He wanted to be the guy who comes after Ben Gurion. And it's a very good chance he would get there. After this, he joins the Ben Gurion against the Mapai party. Who were the next prime minister of Israel? Eshkol, Golda Meir, Rabin. The first item in the Mapai platform is down with Peres. This is actually one of the reasons Menachem Begin came into power. If anybody remembers long enough, the Labor Party, Peres and Rabin were shooting each other all the time, and Begin was able to get in. You understand? There were the bitter feelings that are in there. It really messed his career. By the time all that passed, it was already in the 1980s, and it wasn't the same Peres anymore, and it is what it is. The entire affair in those years was subject to military censorship, so a whole lexicon of euphemisms emerged in Israel. It was like, Mi Natan Hador, who gave the order? You never spoke about the Lavon affair. It was always about Ha'esek Habish, the bad business, the mess. You understand? Avri Elad was always the third man. The secretary was referred to, I forget, under some name. Everything was under. So you see newspapers, it's like 1984. The old man said to the secretary that the third man was seen, in the Asik Bish over here. And so that is how the discourse was run, because Israel in those years is before the YouTube and before all this stuff just got out, for the age of the internet. And Israel still had a fairly effective military censorship business, and people felt it's necessary to follow the censorship rules. Of course, that means that on the Israeli street, it's a feast of gossip and speculation. It was radioactive. I mean, everybody was hawking big time. Whether it's a synagogue or anywhere else, who did what and I know who the third man really is. No, you don't. All this kind of stuff. Lavon never got his rehabilitation. Died a bitter old man in 1976, and so the Lavon affair, as we call it in English, Asik Beish they call in Hebrew, revealed that although power was concentrated in those years in the hands of Mapai, the Mapai party itself was composed of factions, often warring factions. Publicly, they presented a united front. Behind doors, it was a different matter. On the other hand, it also revealed that Israel, at the end of the day, was a democracy, in which the truth always does get out sooner or later. We're not totally unfamiliar with this in American history. Isn't that what happened with Watergate? Okay, it gets out sooner or later. It's messy, but the alternative is worse. Go back. You don't hear too many scandals coming in the dictatorship country. This stuff doesn't get out there. But then what happens? It erupts into a huge violent situation. So we are who we are. We are messy, but we are a democracy. Good night.
Great news. Oh, you turn it off? Removing impossible spying?
That was
Ellie
Ellie Cohn, yeah.
Yeah.
Wasn't a good